Comrades, ask yourselves this simple but devastating question: how can a society claim greatness when those who build it live in the shadows of hunger, insecurity, and exhaustion? How can a ruling class call itself superior when it contributes nothing but orders, while you whose hands shape the world are denied even the fruits of your own labor? The truth is clearer than the morning sun. The world exists because of you, because the worker is the foundation upon which every institution, every industry, every comfort of the privileged class rests. And yet you are told to be grateful, obedient, and silent. Today we tear apart that lie. Look around, every road is paved by you. Every building stands because your muscles lifted the stones. Every machine functions because your sweat soaked the factory floor. Every line of code, every harvest of crops, every spark of electricity that lights their mansions and their markets originates from you. Without the worker, society collapses into dust. Without capital, the worker still creates. This simple reality is the greatest secret capitalism must conceal to survive. But comrades, reality does more than reveal exploitation. It exposes the structure of domination. The ruling class does not merely own wealth, it owns the means by which wealth is produced, and therefore it owns the power to dictate your lives. Its dominance is not accidental. It is systematic. It is engineered. It is woven into the very economic architecture of capitalism. You labor endlessly, yet remain dispossessed. You produce surplus, yet see only wages that barely sustain you. You create value, yet the owner sees its extraction. The system thrives because it ensures that your life is spent enriching someone else. The capitalist calls this freedom. But what freedom exists when survival depends on selling your time, your strength, your mind piece by piece to those who profit from your necessity? They preach competition, yet depend entirely on your cooperation. They glorify the individual, yet their fortunes rise only when millions work collectively. And they speak of merit, yet inherit the wealth that gives them absolute control. This is the contradiction at the heart of capitalism. You create everything, but control nothing. They create nothing, but control everything. Comrades, capitalism is not merely an economic system. It is a social relation that chains the worker to perpetual subordination. It survives through ideology, through the illusion that inequality is natural, that hierarchy is inevitable, that you are replaceable. But you are not replaceable. You are indispensable. When workers withdraw their labor, factories fall silent, markets freeze, transport halts, digital systems flicker into uselessness. The ruling class fears this more than any parliament, any reform, any politician, because the moment workers realize their collective power, the entire edifice of capitalist domination trembles. And let us be clear. Oppression is not maintained by the strength of the rulers, but by the division of the ruled. Every attempt to split you by nationality, race, gender, trade, region is calculated. For when workers stand divided, capitalism remains secure, but when workers unite, capitalism becomes indefensible. Therefore, comrades, the task before us is not merely to understand the world, but to transform it through organized power. You must become conscious not only of your exploitation, but of your historic role as the driving force of human progress. This is class consciousness, not an abstract theory, but the awakening that turns scattered anger into collective will. To reclaim what is yours, you must build unity where the ruling class builds separation. You must build organization where capitalism builds chaos. You must build solidarity where they spread competition. For the worker's strength does not lie in individual struggle, but in communal action, in the merging of millions into a single, irresistible force demanding a society where production serves human need, not private profit. Comrades, history does not move gently. Change comes when those who create the world refuse to be its servant. The future belongs not to the owners of capital, but to the creators of value, the workers who keep civilization alive. You are not powerless. You are not voiceless. You are not destined to live in the margins of what you make possible. Stand together. Organize. Educate. Agitate. Build the structures of solidarity that capitalism fears. The world already depends on you now. Let it be shaped by you. The chains that bind you exist only because you are told they cannot be broken. But every revolution in history begins with this recognition: the worker is the true creator, and a world built by the many must never be controlled by the few. And so, comrades, let this truth burn into your consciousness. You are the force that moves history. You are the architects of tomorrow. And the moment you rise together, the world as we know it will be transformed forever. The worker is the true creator of all wealth and the foundation of society, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a material reality that defines every structure, institution, and economic process around us. The world that appears stable, functional, and productive rests entirely upon the ceaseless activity of those whose labor transforms raw nature into usable goods, whose hands construct the physical environment, and whose intellectual and manual efforts sustain the operations of modern life. Every commodity that circulates, every building that stands, every system that functions, and every service that enables daily existence originate in the labor of workers who rarely see their contributions acknowledged beyond a wage that barely reflects the value they generate. Wealth is not conjured by the owners of capital or produced through the abstraction of markets. It is created by human effort, human skill, and human time. The worker shapes the world from the ground up, turning potential into reality, yet is systematically alienated from both the product of their work and the power that should accompany their indispensable role in factories. Workers convert metal, chemicals, and components into machines, vehicles, and technologies that form the backbone of industry. It is not the capitalist who stands at the assembly line, who endures the noise, repetition, and physical strain. It is the worker whose labor infuses lifeless materials with value. In agriculture, it is the laborer who sows, cultivates, and harvests, ensuring the survival of entire populations, while landowners reap profits without touching the soil. In the digital world, programmers, analysts, technicians, and operators create the infrastructures of communication and information, yet ownership of platforms and data grants immense wealth to those who did not write a single line of code or maintain a single server. In every sphere, the pattern repeats. Those who create value do not control it, and those who control value do not create it. This contradiction sits at the heart of economic inequality. The capitalist system elevates ownership over contribution and celebrates accumulation over creation. Workers, despite being essential, are treated as costs to be minimized, tools to be used, or replaceable parts in a vast machine designed to generate profit. Their creative power is exploited precisely because it is so fundamental. The system depends on workers, but hides this dependence by emphasizing the supposed genius, innovation, or leadership of those who merely command rather than produce. This ideological inversion strengthens the illusion that capital, not labor, is the true source of wealth, masking the reality that capital itself is nothing more than accumulated labor from the past. The worker's central role becomes even more evident when labor stops. When workers strike, industries halt, profits vanish, and the supposedly powerful become helpless. A single day without the labor of transport workers disrupts entire nations. A pause in production lines causes supply chains to collapse. When healthcare workers withdraw their services, lives are immediately at risk. When educators stop teaching, entire generations feel the effects. This demonstrates an undeniable truth. Workers are not peripheral components, but the living core of society. Without them, nothing moves, nothing grows, and nothing functions. Yet despite this inherent power, the worker is alienated from the fruits of their labor. They create wealth but cannot access it. They build the physical and social world but do not govern it. Their labor enriches others while leaving them in cycles of insecurity, precarity, and exhaustion. The system relies on workers not recognizing their own power, on individuals feeling isolated in their struggles, and on society being conditioned to overlook the foundational role of labor. The worker becomes invisible, even as their work is everywhere to realize their significance. Workers must understand that their contributions are not limited to physical or manual tasks, but encompass every essential function of collective life. A society without workers cannot survive, while workers without capitalists could reorganize production for the benefit of all rather than the profit of a few. The true creative force behind all wealth lies not in ownership, but in human labor, the countless acts of creation, maintenance, and service that sustain civilization. Recognizing this truth is the first step toward reclaiming the dignity and power that rightfully belong to those who make the world exist through the constant, transformative energy of their labor. Capitalism survives by exploiting labor and concentrating power in the hands of the ruling class, not as an accidental flaw, but as the core mechanism that allows it to function. Its entire structure depends on extracting more value from the worker than the worker is compensated for, turning human effort into profit that flows upward. The laborer remains bound to wages that rarely reflect the true worth of their contribution. The driving force behind capitalist production is not human need or social benefit, but the relentless pursuit of surplus value, the difference between what workers create and what they are paid. This surplus becomes the private property of those who own factories, land, technology, and capital, even though they did not perform the labor that generated it. It is through this process that wealth accumulates in the hands of the ruling class, allowing them to wield disproportionate influence over the economy, politics, media, and social institutions. Capitalism reproduces itself by ensuring that this imbalance remains constant, that exploitation appears normal, and that the power of the ruling class remains unquestioned. Exploitation is not always visible on the surface. It is masked by the wage system, which creates the illusion that workers are compensated fairly for their time. In reality, wages serve as a cost for employers and a means of survival for workers, keeping them tethered to the very system that drains them. The employer buys labor at the lowest feasible cost and sells the results of that labor at the highest possible price. This difference generates profit, but only because the worker produces more value than they receive. The more this gap widens, the more capitalism celebrates efficiency and growth, which are nothing more than euphemisms for intensified exploitation. When wages stagnate while productivity rises, when workers face longer hours, precarious conditions, and increased pressure while owners accumulate record wealth, the mechanism becomes undeniable. Capitalism thrives when workers lack control over their labor and when the ruling class controls the condition under which labor is performed. The concentration of power in the ruling class is not limited to economic domination. Wealth translates into political influence, enabling capitalists to shape laws, policies, and systems to preserve their interests. They fund political campaigns, lobby governments, influence regulations, and command media narratives that justify inequality as the natural order of things. Through this influence, they ensure that labor laws remain weak, unions are undermined, welfare systems are restricted, and workers' rights are limited. Their power becomes self-reinforcing as each generation of accumulated wealth expands their ability to dictate the direction of society. This is why capitalism cannot be reformed into an equal system. Its operation require a ruling class that wields disproportionate control. The very foundations of the system rest on inequality, on the ownership of the means of production by a minority, and on the dependence of the majority. On selling their labor to survive, capitalism also sustains itself through divisions that prevent workers from recognizing their collective power. By fostering competition between workers, whether for jobs, wages, or status, it fragments the very class that produces all wealth. Divisions along lines of nationality, race, gender, or industry further splinter the workforce, ensuring that solidarity becomes difficult and that collective resistance remains fractured. These divisions are not incidental but functional. They prevent workers from realizing that they share common interests and common enemies. The ruling class, meanwhile, remains united in its pursuit of profit and preservation of power, coordinate through institutions, associations, and corporate networks that reinforce their dominance. The more divided the working class becomes, the more secure the ruling class remains in its position of authority. Even technological progress, which could liberate human beings from exhausting labor, becomes a tool for greater concentration of power under capitalism. Automation and innovation, instead of being used to reduce work hours or improve living standards, are deployed to increase profits and reduce labor costs. This results in layoffs, wage suppression, and the intensification of exploitation for those who remain employed. The benefits of technological advancement are monopolized by the ruling class, while the working class bears the burden of instability and insecurity. As long as capitalism governs technology, Progress becomes another means of extracting value and consolidating dominance. Ultimately, capitalism endures because it disguises its exploitation behind the veil of choice, freedom, and opportunity. It tells workers they are free because they may choose their employer, even though they cannot choose whether or not to work. It tells society that wealth reflects merit, even though wealth is accumulated through generations of ownership and exploitation rather than individual effort. It presents itself as the natural, inevitable form of human organization, even though it is sustained only through systems of control, suppression, and inequality. Capitalism cannot survive without exploitation, and it cannot function without concentrated power in the hands of those who own and control the means of production. Its survival depends on workers remaining unaware of their collective strength, isolated in their struggles, and convinced that the current order is unchangeable. The ruling class maintains dominance by dividing workers and masking inequality as natural, using a calculated strategy that reaches into every institution, every narrative, and every social relationship. This domination is not sustained by raw force alone, but by the manipulation of perception, identity, and belief. For the ruling class understands a truth they will never admit publicly: workers, when united, possess a power capable of overturning the entire social order. Therefore, the systems of power rely on ensuring that workers never recognize themselves as a unified class, with shared interests and collective strength. They cultivate divisions that fragment solidarity, replacing unity with suspicion, competition, and internal conflict. These divisions take many forms, each designed to make workers see one another as rivals rather than comrades in the same struggle against exploitation. Through these fractures, the ruling class maintains its position as the seemingly unquestioned authority of economic and social life. One of the most effective tools used to divide workers is the creation of artificial hierarchies within the working class itself. These hierarchies may be built around skill levels, job types, seniority, educational credentials, or employment categories. By elevating some workers slightly above others, the ruling class fosters a sense of superiority or privilege among certain groups of laborers, even though all of them remain fundamentally exploited. A worker who earns more, who has a title, or who holds a marginally more secure position may believe they have escaped the conditions that bind the rest, but in reality they still serve the same system and face the same vulnerabilities. These false distinctions reduce the possibility of unity, trapping workers in petty competition and internal rivalries that distract them from the structural forces that oppress them. All in addition to workplace hierarchies, divisions rooted in nationality, race, ethnicity, gender, and religion are weaponized to further fragment the working class. These identities, which should enrich human society, are manipulated into tools of separation. By encouraging distrust or fear of the other, the ruling class ensures that workers turn their frustrations toward one another instead of toward the system that exploits them. When workers see each other as threats or competitors, they forget that their real adversary is the class that profits from their labor. This method of division is powerful because it embeds inequality into the cultural fabric, making oppression appear as a social norm rather than a deliberate construction. When inequality is normalized in this way, injustice becomes invisible, and exploitation becomes easier to sustain. The ruling class also uses ideology to mask inequality as inevitable or even desirable outcome. Through media, education, and political discourse, they propagate narratives that justify the status quo. They claim that differences in wealth result from personal choice, ambition, or talent, rather than from structural systems designed to concentrate power. By framing success as a matter of individual effort, they obscure the reality that workers, no matter how hard they labor, cannot accumulate wealth on the scale of those who own and inherit capital. They promote meritocracy as a universal truth, even though the economic game is rigged from the start. When inequality is portrayed as natural, workers blame themselves for their struggles instead of recognizing the systemic forces that keep them in a state of subordination. To reinforce this illusion, the ruling class controls the institutions that shape public consciousness. Schools teach obedience, not critical thought. Media outlets emphasize consumerism and spectacle, shifting attention away from exploitation. Politicians funded by elite interests promise change while preserving the economic structure that benefits their benefactors. The overall effect is the creation of a society where questioning inequality appears unreasonable or even dangerous. Workers internalize the belief that their hardships are personal failures, not the result of deliberate policies crafted to maintain class dominance. This internalized oppression ensures that the ruling class does not need to constantly impose authority. The system perpetuates itself because workers are taught to accept their position without resistance. Moreover, the ruling class uses crises to deepen divisions and reinforce control. Economic recessions, political conflicts, and social tensions are manipulated to divert anger away from the true sources of suffering. During crises, workers may be told that immigrants, outsiders, or other marginalized groups are responsible for job losses or social instability. In reality, the ruling class benefits from these crises by restructuring economy, lowering wages, reducing protections, and expanding their own power. The more workers fight each other, the more secure the ruling class becomes. Every conflict among workers strengthens the illusion that inequality is unavoidable or natural, further hiding the hand that orchestrates the conditions of exploitation. In the end, the dominance of the ruling class depends on keeping workers divided, convinced that the inequalities they endure are simply the way the world works. By masking exploitation beneath layers of ideology, identity, and internal competition, they ensure that workers remain fragmented, isolated, and unable to mobilize their immense collective power. Only when workers recognize these divisions as tools of control and see through the deception that inequality is natural will they begin to reclaim the unity necessary to challenge the structures that hold them in subordination. Worker unity and class consciousness are the greatest threats to capitalist control because they expose the fundamental weakness of a system built on division, exploitation, and the illusion of individual powerlessness. Capitalism thrives only when workers believe they are isolated, competing individuals, struggling for survival in a chaotic world that cannot be changed. It depends on people seeing each other as rivals rather than allies, on workers accepting their position as natural, and on the belief that the ruling class is too powerful to oppose. But when workers develop class consciousness, when they understand that they share common interests, common exploitation, and a common adversary, the entire architecture of capitalist domination begins to tremble. Unity transforms the worker from a solitary individual into a collective force capable of redefining society from its foundations, and this transformation is precisely what capitalism fears most. Class consciousness begins with recognition, the understanding that the problems workers face are not personal shortcomings or isolated misfortunes, but the result of systemic exploitation. Low wages, long hours, job insecurity, rising costs of living, and lack of control over the condition of labor all stem from a structure designed to maximize profit for a small class of owners. When workers realize that these struggles are shared across industries, nations, and identities, they begin to see themselves as part of a larger whole, the working class, that produces all wealth yet receives only a fraction of its value. This shift in awareness breaks the ideological chains that capitalism uses to maintain order. Instead of blaming themselves or each other, workers begin to identify the real source of their oppression and the real location of power. The collective strength of their own labor unity amplifies this awakening. A single worker is vulnerable, replaceable, and easy for capitalism to control. A unified class, however, becomes a force that can halt production, disrupt supply chains, mobilize mass resistance, and demand structural change. Capitalists understand that their wealth does not come from machines, ownership, or managerial skill, but from the continuous labor of millions who keep the system running. If those millions move together with a shared purpose, the ruling class cannot maintain its dominance. This is why unity is suppressed at every turn. The entire system is built on ensuring that workers remain divided by race, nationality, gender, religion, and skill level, so they cannot recognize their common power. When unity emerges, even in small forms, it demonstrates the potential for something far greater. the organized movement of a class conscious of its strength. Historical struggles show that every major gain for workers was achieved not through individual effort but collective action. Whether in labor movements, strikes, uprisings, or mass protests, the ruling class has always conceded rights only when pressured by the unified strength of the people they exploit. This is not generosity but necessity. The ruling class fears the consequence of a united workforce far more than it fears temporary disruptions or reforms. Unity is dangerous because it reveals how dependent the system is on those it tries to dominate. When workers refuse to work, when they organize, when they speak with one voice, they expose the truth that capitalism is powerless without the labor it exploits. Class consciousness transforms this awareness into strategy, turning spontaneous anger into coordinated action. Capitalism responds to growing unity with intensified ideological manipulation. It promotes individualism to weaken solidarity, consumerism to distract from exploitation, and competition to fragment collective identity. Workers are told that success is personal and failure is their own fault, creating internal divisions that prevent united struggle. Media narratives highlight differences rather than commonalities. Political discourse is shaped to pit groups against each other. These tactics reveal capitalism's deepest insecurity that workers, united in consciousness and purpose, possess the capacity to dismantle the system entirely. Every attempt to suppress unity is an admission of how vulnerable the ruling class truly is in the face of organized labor. The creation of class consciousness also challenges the ruling class's ideological power. Once workers understand that they produce all wealth, they begin to question why they do not control the fruits of their labor. They question why a small minority directs the lives of the vast majority, why inequality is justified, and why society is organized to benefit those who do not work while burdening those who do. This awakening threatens not only the economic structure of capitalism, but the legitimacy of its authority. When workers recognize themselves as the true creators of social value, the ruling class loses the ideological foundation it depends on to maintain dominance. Ultimately, unity and class consciousness combine to form a force that capitalism cannot absorb, manipulate, or destroy. They shift power downward, away from the elite and toward the masses who keep society functioning. They expose exploitation not as an unfortunate flaw, but as the structural logic of capitalism. And they reveal that the system persists only as long as workers accept the conditions imposed upon them. When workers unite, when they become conscious of their class position, they no longer see themselves as isolated individuals, but as a collective capable of shaping their own destiny. This recognition marks the beginning of a transformative process that threatens the very existence of capitalist control. Organized collective action is the path to reclaiming power and transforming society because it channels the scattered frustrations, isolate struggles, and individual hardships of workers into a unified force capable of reshaping the structures that govern their lives. No ruling class in history has surrendered its power voluntarily. No system built on exploitation has dissolved through polite appeals or isolated efforts. Every meaningful transformation has emerged from the deliberate, coordinated actions of people who understood that their power lies not in acting alone, but in acting together with shared purpose. Collective organization gives form to resistance, discipline to anger, and direction to the immense, but often latent power of the working class. It transforms the oppressed from passive recipients of exploitation into active agents of change by unifying their efforts in ways that the ruling class cannot ignore or suppress without consequence. Without organization, workers remain fragmented, each facing exploitation as an individual burden. They may possess anger, but anger alone does not change material conditions. Workers may see the injustices around them, but without structures to coordinate their responses, those injustices persist unchallenged. Capitalism thrives on this disorganization, relying on the fact that individual workers cannot meaningfully disrupt production or confront the massive institutions that enforce inequality. The system encourages isolation through the illusion of individual choice, the myth of personal advancement, and the fragmentation of labor across countless sectors. But when workers organize, they create channels through which their individual struggles merge into a collective front. Organization provides communication, strategy, and cohesion, allowing workers to transition from scattered dissent to unified action collective. Action shifts the balance of power because the functioning of society depends on the continuous labor of the working class. When workers coordinate their actions, whether through strikes, walkouts, boycotts, or mass mobilizations, they disrupt the machinery of capitalism at its core. A single worker refusing to work is easily replaced, but thousands refusing together halt production, interrupt profit, and reveal how fragile the system truly is. This disruption forces the ruling class to confront the reality that their power is not absolute but relies entirely on the cooperation of those they exploit. Organized collective action exposes the dependency of capital on labor, undermining the ideological illusion that the ruling class alone drives progress. It reveals that the wealth, stability, and functioning of society are produced by workers who, when united, hold the capacity to reshape that society according to their collective interests. Transformational change does not emerge from spontaneous action alone, but from sustained, organized efforts that build institutions of worker power. Unions, councils, collectives, and grassroots movements serve as the backbone of this organization, creating spaces where workers can educate themselves, coordinate strategies, and construct alternative structures of decision-making. These institutions cultivate discipline and consciousness, allowing workers to understand not only the injustices they face, but the systemic nature of those injustices and the pathways to overcoming them. Organized movements develop long-term strategies, build networks across regions and industries, and strengthen solidarity that extends beyond local or temporary grievances. Through this sustained organization, workers create the capacity to confront the ruling class on equal footing, and to envision a society not governed by the logic of profit but by the needs of the many. Organized action also breaks the ideological chains that keep workers submissive. When individuals act collectively, they begin to see that their struggles are not personal failures but shared experiences rooted in structural exploitation. This realization deepens class consciousness and fosters a sense of collective identity. Workers begin to understand that their liberation is bound to the liberation of others and that transformation requires unity rather than competition. Collective action nurtures this unity, replacing the capitalist narrative of individualism with a sense of belonging to a powerful, organized community. As this consciousness grows, workers become more resilient to the manipulations of the ruling class, less susceptible to divisions, and more committed to the pursuit of systemic change. Moreover, organized collective action creates new forms of democratic participation that challenge the hierarchical structures of capitalism. When workers deliberate together, make decisions collectively, and act in coordination, they practice a form of democracy that capitalism cannot provide. This democratic experience becomes a rehearsal for a future society where power is distributed among the people who create the wealth, not concentrated in the hands of those who own it. Organized action, therefore, does more than resist exploitation. It builds the foundations for an alternative social order rooted in equality, solidarity, and shared power. Ultimately, the transformative power of organized collective action lies in its ability to convert potential energy into material force. It is the mechanism through which workers reclaim agency, confront exploitation, and assert their right to shape the world they sustain through their labor. Through unity in action, the working class transcends its imposed limitations and steps into its historic role as the engine of social transformation. In the end, the truth becomes impossible to deny. The world stands, moves, and progresses because of the worker. And yet the worker remains the most exploited, divided, and dispossessed force within society. Capitalism depends on this contradiction, thriving only by obscuring the workers' power and by elevating the ruling class as the natural masters of a system they did not build. But once workers recognize that every factory, every field, every office, every road, every institution, and every corner of civilization exists because of their labor, the illusion of capitalist supremacy begins to shatter. Through class consciousness, they uncover the shared chains that bind them. Through unity, they rediscover the strength that can break those chains, and through organized collective action, they forge the means to reclaim what has always belonged to them. The ruling class fears this awakening because it signals the end of their control and the dawn of a society shaped not by profit but by the collective will of those who create all wealth. When workers rise together with clear vision and united purpose, the foundations of exploitation tremble, and a new world built by the many for the many comes within reach.